Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Oklahoma Territory. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the spring of 1871, a sparse wagon trail etched its way into the unsettled lands that lay between Kansas and the territories further south. In that year, the territory soon to become Oklahoma was still wild, with no formal courts or steady lawmen in large stretches. Into that vacuum came Corrick's Rest, an unassuming two-story wooden inn erected near a dry creek bed and dusty crossroads. The proprietor, Jedediah Corrick, originally from Missouri, arrived with his wife Martha, daughter Eleanor, and two sons, Samuel and Isaac. They also brought a youth named Jonas Pike, hired from a neighboring settlement. From the start, the inn bore an oddness no visitor could fully explain. The structure was modest, pine boards, a tiled stove, shuttered windows, but something about it seemed to breathe silence. One stagecoach guard's ledger, penned in July of 1872, reads, "We lodged at Corrick's. The innkeeper spoke little. At midnight, we heard a child sobbing, though no child was with us." Local supply towns, Benton's Crossing, Dry Creek, and the dealer posts along the trail carried hushed warnings. Don't stay long at Corrick's. That place hides its darkness. In the Benton's Crossing County records, the Corricks appear in ledgers under land improvements, pasture fencing, and light disputes over livestock, but no crime, no arrests. In an era where lawlessness and outlaw sanctuaries were part of frontier lore, Corrick's Rest did not at first attract suspicion. It sat too quietly for that. And yet, when historians later examined cases like the Battle of Ingalls, they noticed parallels, remote posts that became havens for hidden violence, where silence swallowed refugees and trespassers alike. The Corricks, long before 1893, may have been living in such a shadowed margin. One photograph, now lost, is described in the 1888 county inventory. The entire Corrick family standing, rigidly in front of the inn, faces grave. At the mother's feet a small goat crouches, its head resting against her skirts, an odd domestic detail in a forbidding tableau. What that goat meant went unspoken, but many who saw the photograph years later remembered its unsettling stillness. All seemed calm through 1872 to 73. The inn was known enough to host travelers, but rarely more than one or two at a time. The corridors were kept quiet. Corrick himself was said to spend late nights beneath the floor, mumbling to himself and hammering wood. Martha kept to her chambers. The children rarely appeared in public. Rumors trickled, but nothing concrete emerged. It was during those quiet years that the first disappearances occurred. One traveler vanishing without trace, another's belongings found behind the stable. None of the deaths, if deaths there were acknowledged officially. The case, as boundary posts often do, seemed to vanish into the same silence that cloaked Corrick's Rest. By the summer of 1874, Corrick's Rest had grown stiller, its lantern the only sign of life along that stretch of prairie road. Travelers began to ride past without stopping, choosing instead to sleep in their wagons under the open sky. The building itself seemed to have aged unnaturally, its timbers blackened, the porch sagged. Locals said the air near the inn smelled faintly of iron. A half-yearly county survey lists the Corricks as in possession, household of 6, structure sound. The clerk who visited wrote a single marginal note beside their entry. No livestock seen, though noises of animals heard beneath the flooring. Among the few who did enter that house was a freight driver named Willard Keyes, who in his later years gave a trembling account to a newspaperman. Keyes had been hired to deliver flour in bulk from Benton's Crossing to the inn. The girl, Eleanor, she was brushing a goat by the door, he recalled. She never looked up. When I spoke, she said, "He doesn't like voices near the house." Inside, Jedediah Corrick greeted him with polite formality. The main room smelled of lamp oil and damp soil. Keyes unloaded the sacks and was paid in full. As he turned to leave, he noticed two things. The floorboards had fresh nails, and from beneath them came a slow dripping sound, like water seeping into earth. That autumn, a traveling salesman named Rufus Bell spent a night there. His employer's ledgers note his last transaction in early October 1874. He never reached his next destination. 2 weeks later, his horse was found tethered behind the inn, watered and fed, but Bell himself was gone. The Corricks claimed he had left before dawn. The deputy from Guthrie, Aaron Pike, one of the few lawmen for hundreds of miles, rode out to investigate. His report survives in the Territorial Marshal's Logbook, Volume 3. No disturbance seen. Floors newly sanded. Soil behin. Deed stable disturbed. Owner states he buried swine. Family calm, if withdrawn. Nothing further to pursue. And that was that. In a place where record-keeping was inconsistent, and graves were as common as coyotes, the case dissolved into dust. When the spring thaw came, more wagons went missing. Some were found days later, horses wandering, cargo untouched. Travelers spoke of eerie lights flickering along the ridge behind Corrick's Rest. A woman named Margaret Phelps, who lived 3 miles east, swore she heard hammering long after midnight for several nights in a row. It sounded like someone fixing a coffin, she later told a priest. Letters believed to be written by Martha Corrick surfaced decades later, hidden in a trunk. One read, "Jed works beneath the floor and says the earth must be fed. He keeps a ledger of those who pass through, though not all are written twice." By 1875, no one stayed at Corrick's Rest willingly. The road grew over with weeds, and only the wind visited. Yet the lantern still burned each dusk, steady and waiting, as though it knew travelers would come again. Historians later compared this eerie quiet to the outlaw enclaves that would arise before the Battle of Ingalls nearly 20 years later. Communities that lived by silence and secrecy until violence forced them into history. The Corricks never met that kind of public end. They simply kept vanishing into their own house, leaving only that flicker of light to mark their existence. The thaw of 1876 brought rain heavy enough to wash out portions of the wagon trail leading past Corrick's Rest. Floodwater carved deep channels into the soil, uncovering pieces of broken crockery, bits of metal, and once what appeared to be a human tooth near the creek bed. A farmhand who found it turned it in to the sheriff of Benton's Crossing, but the sheriff merely tossed it into his desk drawer and forgot it. The territory was too wide, and missing travelers were common. That spring, a Swedish immigrant named Anders Holm, his wife Clara, and their infant daughter passed through. Holm's last letter to a friend in Wichita survives. Its ink faded. "We stopped at a lodging called Corrick's Rest. The woman was pale and kind but fearful, the man quiet and fixed of eye. The rooms were clean, yet smelled of tallow and dust. I paid in advance for supper and bed. It was the only roof for miles." 3 days later, a mail driver found the Holmes wagon overturned in a ditch 5 miles north. The horses had been cut loose. A Bible belonging to the family was discovered nearby, its pages damp and torn, pressed into the mud as if by a hand. Deputy Pike again rode out, accompanied this time by Dr. Henry Murdoch, a physician from Guthrie. Their official notes describe the inn as occupied in order. The cellar door, Pike wrote, was secured by fresh planking nailed from within. Jedediah Corrick claimed the Holmes had departed at sunrise, taking the south road toward Texas. The doctor noticed a darker stain seeping through one section of the floor. When asked, Corrick said a goat had been butchered there days earlier. Murdoch's testimony later read, "The smell was not of animal blood. It was older, heavier, the odor of rust and confinement." They left without digging. For months afterward, settlers near Benton's Crossing reported seeing small fires burning at night across the ridge, bluish, low flames that never spread like grass fire. A rancher's wife told her minister she saw Eleanor Corrick walking the ridge one dawn, barefoot, carrying something wrapped in a shawl. It looked, she said, like a sleeping child, or a small animal with horns. By 1877, travelers had learned to skirt that road entirely. The inn became a landmark of dread, a dark silhouette against the horizon. A group of cattle drovers who camped nearby claimed they heard voices coming from beneath the ground, as if prayers were being whispered through wood. It was that same year that Jonas Pike, the hired boy who'd once worked for the Corricks, was officially declared missing. A trapper swore he'd seen Jonas wandering near the Cimarron River, muttering that the dead don't rest easy where the lantern burns. The trapper thought him drunk and rode on. Later that summer, heavy rains washed away more soil behind the inn. The deputy returned, this time with 2 locals. Beneath the mud, they uncovered bones. Small, scattered, irregular. Dr. Murdoch again examined the remains, describing them as human, 1 adult, 1 juvenile, condition partial, burial hasty. No names could be assigned. Yet no arrests followed. The territory had no clear authority to hold the Koriks, and without identifiable victims, there was nothing to prosecute. Years later, historians would compare this failure to the lack of enforcement that plagued Oklahoma Territory before the Battle of Ingalls. The same lawlessness that let outlaws flourish also protected the silent, the secretive, and the damned. In the winter of 1878, Koriks Rest still stood. The lantern still burned. But now, locals said, the light swayed on nights when there was no wind at all. By the time 1878 turned to winter, the Korik family had nearly vanished from the memory of Benton's Crossing. The trail itself had fallen out of use, replaced by a newer route further east. Yet for those few who still passed that way, Koriks Rest became a landmark of unease, a shape half swallowed by prairie grass, its windows like sockets in a skull. One such traveler, a merchant named Thomas Leary, kept a small journal that later surfaced in his estate papers. His entry, dated November 28th, reads, "Stopped at a place called Koriks. The woman smiled, but her hands trembled. There was a smell as of iron and smoke. Supper was plain, bread and beans, but the broth left a metallic taste. I think it was cooked in a pot not properly cleaned." Leary wrote of hearing steady thudding beneath the floor late that night, as if someone were swinging a hammer in slow rhythm. When he rose at dawn, Jedediah Korik was already outside, stacking firewood near a hole in the ground. He told Leary it was an old root cellar he meant to fill in. The merchant left quickly. 2 days later, a passing herdsman found Leary's wagon overturned 5 miles north, his goods scattered but his purse untouched. His horse had been cut free and wandered toward the creek. Leary himself was gone. By then, the inn had taken on the weight of legend. Travelers began to call it the Death Trap. The name first appeared in a letter from a marshal in Guthrie, who warned a fellow officer to avoid the old inn west of the ridge. That family eats misfortune. In early 1879, a violent storm struck the prairie. Lightning burned the roof of the inn, and smoke was seen rising for days. When neighbors finally rode out, they found the upper floor collapsed, and the cellar exposed like an open wound. Inside were 5 rough mounds of earth. 2 contained partial remains, 1 female, 1 small, and childlike. Dr. Murdoch, again called to examine, noted unmistakable human form, though incomplete. His report, now kept in the Oklahoma Territorial Archives, also mentions a brass hairpin, fragments of glass, and traces of lime. The Korik family was gone. No bodies, no sign of departure. Only their goat remained, wandering the property, thin and pale as smoke. A local trapper named Elias Crane swore he saw a figure on the ridge days later, a man walking with a lantern, dragging something behind him. "He talked to it like you talk to a dog," Crane said. But it didn't walk right, it bumped. Authorities ordered the property sealed, yet in those ungoverned lands, such orders meant little. The inn remained, a burned husk, its cellar slowly sinking into the ground. Over the next decade, settlers avoided it. The few who camped nearby claimed to hear hammering underground, slow and rhythmic as before. Historians later drew parallels between Koriks Rest and the hideouts that would shelter gangs before the Battle of Ingalls. Both places were born of isolation. Both ended in fire and disappearance. But while Ingalls was remembered in headlines, Koriks Rest slipped quietly out of record. Too small, too strange, too forgotten. By 1880, only the wind knew their names. Yet on nights when the moon hung low and the plains turned silver, Riders said they still saw that lantern flicker once, then vanish, like a final heartbeat under the earth. When settlers returned to that section of prairie in the mid-1880s, the ruins of Corrick's Rest were little more than weathered beams and scorched stones. The land was listed as abandoned and unfit for cultivation. Children from Benton's Crossing were warned never to wander that far, yet stories of the place drew them in. They dared one another to climb the hill at dusk and look for the cellar that breathed. A surveyor named Henry Lowell claimed the property during the 1889 land opening. His first entry in a small field journal reads, "Ground soft, uneven, found remains of old structure, boards black, soil beneath strangely hollow. Will build my cabin on the higher rise to the east." Lowell was practical, but he could not ignore what the soil kept giving back. In March, he wrote of digging post holes and striking wood that splintered like coffin boards. Later he noted, "A chain, corroded, looped through earth, as if once fastened to something living." He buried it again and moved his marker stones north. Through that first year, Lowell reported losing livestock, 2 goats, then a calf, without signs of predators. Each morning he found shallow depressions near his fence line, the edges smoothed as if by hands. The third time, he woke to find his barn door open and a single hoofprint burned into the frozen ground. He sold the claim the following spring. The new owner, a young minister named Reverend Cale Benton, arrived with a wagon of hymnals and a conviction to bless the cursed ground. His brief presence survives in parish correspondence preserved by the territorial church. "I prayed at the ruins where the inn once stood. Beneath the ashes I heard a faint tapping, measured and hollow, as if echoing from within the earth. I covered my ears, but the sound continued inside my head." He left within weeks. By the 1890s, the story of Corrick's Rest became part of Ying, the region's folklore. Wagon men spoke of a lantern glow that rose from the ridge and drifted down toward the creek, then vanished when approached. Old-timers said it was Jedediah himself, still tending his guests. Others whispered that it was only gas from the marsh, catching moonlight. Historians began to piece together what little record survived. Old ledgers, letters never mailed, a single physician's report signed by Dr. Murdoch. Comparing it to the outlaw archives after the Battle of Ingalls, they noted a pattern. Isolated families turning inward, violence feeding on secrecy, the land itself swallowing truth. Corrick's Rest fit neatly into that grim lineage, an early echo of frontier lawlessness, but smaller, quieter, stripped of glory. In 1897, fire swept through the Benton's Crossing courthouse. The few remaining files, property deeds, marshal reports, even the home's missing persons notice, were lost. What facts remained became rumor, and rumor hardened into story. By 1900, nothing marked the site but a patch of darker soil and a few warped nails glinting in the grass. Still, travelers passing that way claimed their horses balked and refused to cross the ridge. One man described it best in a letter to his sister. "It is not haunted in the manner of ghosts, but in the manner of memory. The ground remembers what it was made to hold." And so the case of Corrick's Rest was left unclosed, its silence sealed beneath layers of time, its story surviving only in the voices of those who swore the earth. There still moved, ever so slightly, like something trying to breathe. In the opening years of the new century, when Oklahoma Territory was nearing statehood, the old trail past the ridge was mapped again. Survey teams from Guthrie cataloged abandoned parcels, noting old structures, forgotten wells, and the ghosts of earlier settlements. On the edge of their charts appears a faint label in pencil: "Former Inn, unstable ground." No one alive then remembered the name Corrick, but the place still carried a quiet reputation. Horses startled near it. Compasses wavered when set down in the grass. One of the survey assistants, Edgar Mullins, kept meticulous field notes. In an entry from May 1902, he described camping overnight near the old foundation. His words, later published in a regional almanac, remain among the few first-hand records of the site in the 20th century. At night, the ground gave off warmth, though the air was cool. A soft ticking came from beneath, regular as a clock. Toward midnight, it stopped. Then something exhaled, long and low, and the soil sank a little under my bedroll. He left the area the next morning and refused to sleep on open prairie again. A few months later, workers clearing brush for a telegraph line discovered fragments of old furniture beneath the sod, chair legs, rusted nails, and a charred beam with a carved phrase barely visible under soot. "We keep what the road forgets." The words matched those found earlier on the inn's kitchen table, linking the ruins to the vanished Corrick family beyond doubt. A local historian, Professor Alton de Vere of Guthrie College, began compiling a brief paper on unrecorded homicides of the frontier. In his draft, he compared Corrick's Rest to other lost settlements that ended violently, citing the outlaw encampments around Ingalls as a larger social symptom, isolation breeding secrecy, and secrecy festering into violence. De Vere's manuscript ended abruptly with the line, "There is reason to believe the ground still holds more than memory." The rest of the paper was never found. That same year, prospectors searching the ridge for mineral deposits reported finding an old iron ring embedded in stone, attached to nothing, but polished from long use, as though something had once been tethered there. When one of them tried to pry it loose, the metal fractured cleanly, revealing inside its hollow core a scrap of parchment sealed with wax. The writing was faint, water-eaten, but one word was legible: Jonas. The men, uneasy, reburied it. By 1905, a fence was erected around the property when cattle began breaking legs in sudden sinkholes. Ranchers complained of soft spots that seemed to shift, as if tunnels still wound beneath the surface. None of them stayed long enough to find out. When Oklahoma entered statehood in 1907, the name Corrick's Rest was omitted from official maps. The area was filed under agricultural reserve, its records merged, and eventually lost in county reorganization. Yet letters from traveling preachers still mentioned the lonely ridge where the earth sighs, and wagon teams avoided camping nearby. Even now, the soil there is darker than the rest, richer perhaps, or simply unwilling to forget, and those who cross it at night claim to hear something faint beneath their boots, not the whisper of grass, but the dull thump of wood striking earth in an endless rhythm, the same slow hammering that once echoed through the floors of the forgotten inn. By 1908, settlers had begun referring to the area simply as the Hollow. They said the land there never stayed still. Crops refused to take root, fences leaned after a single season, and wells caved in without warning. Despite this, the territory's new administrators offered homesteading incentives to repopulate the neglected parcels. Few accepted. Those who did seldom lasted the year. The most detailed account from this period comes from Rachel Dorr, a widow who filed a claim nearby. Her diary, discovered decades later in a county attic, paints the Hollow with eerie clarity. "The ridge feels hollow beneath my step, and on quiet evenings the wind hums like a wire. My lantern flickers, though no draught touches it. I have stopped using my cellar. It whispers as I descend." Rachel was described as practical, not prone to superstition. Yet her later entries grow desperate. She wrote of hearing a child calling from the ridge and of finding goat tracks leading to her door, though she owned no livestock. In her final dated note she scrawled, "He comes walking after dark. The lantern swings again." The next spring, a survey crew found her cabin abandoned. The table was set for one. On the chair lay a folded scrap of paper with the same carved phrase once found on Corrick's Rest: "We keep what the road forgets." Rachel was never seen again. A regional journalist named Howard Penn later collected testimonies about the site, hoping to write a book on Oklahoma's unsolved frontier disappearances. His notes survive in fragments: interviews with farmers, letters from transient laborers, and one statement from a telegraph lineman. That lineman, Earl Sutton, claimed to have seen a light at the ridge while working the night shift. "It wasn't lightning," he wrote, "and it wasn't lantern flame. It moved under the ground like a glowworm trapped in soil." Penn's manuscript remains, yet unfinished. He left Guthrie in 1911, reportedly after developing a nervous complaint that prevented him from traveling west of the Cimarron again. That same year, during a mild drought, the Hollow opened. Rain had failed for months, and the earth began to crack. A ranch hand named Miller fell through one of the fissures while chasing a stray calf. His companions pulled him out, shaken and rambling about what he'd seen. "Stairs," he kept saying. "Wooden stairs going down, still wet." He refused to return, and a week later left the territory entirely. Curiosity drew a few others to look. They found only a shallow depression, half filled with dust, leading nowhere. Within days, a storm covered it again. Scholars later described this pattern, a place that reveals itself only to vanish, as a hallmark of Oklahoma's buried ghost settlements. They compared it once more to Ingalls, where shifting fortunes and secrecy erased whole lives in a single generation. But while Ingalls' legacy lay in gunfire and outlaw folklore, Corrick's Rest endured as something quieter and more enduring, an absence that resisted closure. By 1915, the last map to mark the ridge labeled it simply unexplored ground. After that, even the cartographers stopped naming it. The land, in its own way, had succeeded in swallowing every word ever spoken about it. And still, when storms roll across that plain, travelers say the lightning there strikes lower, closer to the earth, as if drawn to something buried that never truly died. By 1916, Oklahoma Territory was a young state, hungry for order and eager to bury its rough beginnings beneath railroads and courthouses. Yet the ridge once called Corrick's Rest resisted domestication. Survey crews, road builders, even church groups that passed through left it off their records. The prairie swallowed each attempt to rename it. That spring, a minor excavation was ordered to test the ground for potential railway grading. The project foreman, Charles Hentley, filed a short report to the Department of Works. Soil composition unstable, multiple sink points, found remnants of wood framing at irregular depth, not corresponding to any mapped structure. Advised cessation of dig. Unofficially, laborers spoke of hearing hollow knocking beneath their tools, like distant carpentry. One man quit on the spot, muttering that someone's still building down there. The only artifacts retrieved were a corroded latch, a broken teacup, and a length of wire twisted into the shape of a cross. When shown to an elderly settler from Benton's Crossing, she turned pale and said, "That wire came from the Corricks. They strung it for traps." The story might have ended there, another buried fragment of frontier myth. But in 1918, an influenza epidemic swept through the region, emptying farms and shuttering schools. Families fled to remote places to avoid contagion, and one group, 5 people from Guthrie, set up camp near the hollow, unaware of its history. A letter from one of them, Miss Ada Rowe, survives. Written to her cousin, but never sent, it was found years later tucked inside a hymnal from a church sale. We hear tapping at night, soft like rain under the ground. The children think it's miners, but there are no mines. Yesterday, Tom swore he saw a light move under the soil, traveling from the ridge to the old well. I feel watched here. I pray for morning. None of T. Hero party were recorded as returning to Guthrie. Their wagon was found the next summer, horses gone, the camp half buried by sand. On the hearthstones they'd used for a fire, someone had arranged 5 small iron nails in a perfect circle. When a local physician was later asked to investigate, he declined, saying the land was already claimed by its own history. Decades later, folklorists would trace these accounts as evidence that some stories never truly die but shift, adapting to each generation's fear. The Battle of Ingalls, they argued, had become a cautionary tale of lawlessness, Corrick's Rest, a warning against what happens when silence takes root deeper than memory. Even now, cattlemen passing near the ridge notice odd behavior in their herds, animals halting, ears twitching, refusing to move. Some say they hear breathing beneath the earth when the ground is still and warm. Others dismiss it as wind passing through the limestone cracks. But the oldest ranchers refuse to camp there. They call it the place that keeps count. And when night comes, they say, if you listen long enough, you'll hear someone still working the soil, slow, patient, and tireless, building a home for guests who never leave. By the early 1920s, progress had crept over much of the old territory. Oil prospectors, surveyors, and land companies crisscrossed Oklahoma, charting what was once wilderness. But the stretch once marked as Corrick's Rest remained curiously blank. The first oil team to attempt drilling there, Midwestern Extraction Company, packed up after only 3 days. Their report to headquarters was curt: site unviable, ground vibrates, equipment malfunctions, workers refuse return. A foreman later admitted to a local editor that the machinery kept seizing up as if magnetized by something below. When pressed, he added quietly, "It's not stone down there. It's hollow, like hitting a drum." The company left its derrick half-assembled and never came back. Locals scavenged its metal frame for scrap. Some of the beams were used to fence cattle fields miles away. Others said the iron rusted faster than normal, no matter how it was treated. Meanwhile, regional papers began printing serialized accounts of the old inn, calling it Oklahoma's Forgotten House. The stories, half fact and half fancy, retold the disappearances and fires in lurid tones, though none could verify sources. One piece claimed that bones surfaced during every storm, another that a woman's voice was heard praying under the floorboards long after the house burned. One article, however, took a different tone. It came from Professor Edwin Morrow, a historian who had lectured on territorial lawlessness and the Battle of Ingalls. Morrow argued that Corrick's Rest represented a pre-Ingalls example of unrecorded frontier crime, a domestic outlawry unpoliced and unresolved. He wrote, "In a landscape without law, even families could vanish into silence, and no one would stand witness. Corrick's Rest may not have been singular. It may simply be the only one whose name we remember." His essay, published in 1922, revealed that interest in the site. Amateur explorers began visiting the ridge. They brought cameras, spades, and morbid curiosity. Most returned disappointed, finding only scrub grass and scattered boards. Yet a few came back uneasy. One man, Calvin Eves, claimed that when he knelt to dig, the earth pushed back, like a lung exhaling. His companion refused to confirm the story. That same summer, a rare drought cracked the soil wide again. Ranch hands spotted faint impressions in the dust, boot prints, small and deep, leading toward where the inn once stood. There, half buried in the dirt, they found the rusted frame of a lantern. Inside, instead of a wick, was a folded slip of paper. Time had eaten the words, except for a single phrase: "We keep what the road forgets." When news of the find reached Guthrie, Morrow wrote a final note in his research log. The Corrick family's story resists completion. Each attempt to document it only uncovers another fragment, as if the past itself wishes to remain undisturbed. A year later, Morrow drowned in a shallow creek near the ridge. Locals said he'd been mapping the contours of the land when the bank gave way. The coroner called it an accident. Others whispered the ground had simply opened to take him too. The official inquiry into his death ended with no findings. The file was marked, "Closed without cause." Yet travelers passing the ridge at dusk soon reported a new detail: one light instead of none. A pale, steady glow visible only from the road, hovering just above the soil where the cellar once lay, and swaying gently, as though in greeting. No one who went to investigate ever found it again. By 1924, the ghost of Corrick's Rest had evolved from local warning to regional obsession. Students at the Guthrie Normal School began collecting frontier legends for a folklore project, and the ridge featured prominently. One student, Lydia Brandt, rode out with 2 classmates to sketch the terrain. Her notes survive in a thin, leather-bound field book now stored at the Oklahoma Historical Society. "We reached the ridge before dusk," she wrote. "The grass moved though there was no wind. The soil felt soft, warm, and slightly trembling. No sign of a foundation, only depressions where rooms might once have been. When I stepped into the center, the earth dipped as though something shifted beneath." Her companions laughed it off until they noticed the same. One described the sensation as standing on stretched canvas with someone breathing underneath. They left before sunset, unnerved but unhurt. When they developed their photographs a week later, one exposure showed what appeared to be a faint doorway etched into the grass, shadow without structure. The negative was later lost. That same autumn, an aging trapper named Elias Crane, one of the last living men to have seen the Corrick place standing, gave an interview to the Guthrie Gazette. He recounted how he'd once watched a figure dragging a lantern near the ridge after the fire of 1879. Now, nearly 50 years later, his memory had not softened. "It weren't a man," he said. "The thing held the lantern, but the light never touched it. It walked slow, and the ground moved after it like water." Crane died 2 months after the interview. His obituary mentioned only that he passed peacefully at home. With renewed public interest, local authorities fenced the area once more, citing erosion hazards. They installed warning signs against trespassing. That spring, 2 of those signs vanished, and a third was found twisted into the dirt, letters burned away as if by heat. In 1926, a traveling preacher named Reverend Abel Corman visited the ridge claiming divine instruction to lay its spirits to rest. Witnesses said he carried a lantern of his own and sang hymns through the night. In the morning his horse was grazing by the road, but Corman was gone. Only his lantern remained, upright in the soil and still burning, though its oil was long spent. A week later, the Gazette printed one last column on the subject. Its closing lines struck a tone both weary and resigned. "Some wounds do not close because they were never cleanly cut. The earth holds its memory, and sometimes that memory hums." After that, the ridge fell silent again. No more articles, no more expeditions. Locals avoided the area entirely. The new generation, raised on automobiles and electricity, soon forgot the legend, or claimed to. Still, on clear nights when headlights sweep across the plain, drivers say their beams catch a brief flash of reflected glass where no structure stands. Some claim it's just broken bottles. Others swear it's a window, one that shouldn't still exist. And if you stop your engine and listen long enough, a faint tapping can sometimes be heard. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more, rhythmic as a heartbeat. The same pattern described in the oldest reports. The same pulse that began beneath Corrick's Rest half a century before. By the late 1920s, what was once the legend of Corrick's Rest had become a superstition few dared name aloud. The new residents of Benton County regarded the ridge as blighted land, good only for grazing, though even cattle avoided it. The earth there remained strangely soft, refusing to harden after rain. Anyone who fenced it found the posts sinking overnight, as if the ground were drawing them down. A small rail spur built nearby collapsed during grading when one of its engines derailed over a section of track that had sunk a full foot in the night. The engineer, James Braddock, recorded the incident in his work log. "Soil gave way with no sound. Felt like hollow earth beneath. Crew heard tapping through the rails before it fell. 3, then 2. Rhythmic, deliberate. No vibration from wind or wheels." Braddock, not a man given to imagination, requested transfer the next day. That winter, the Guthrie Gazette published a letter from a schoolteacher named Mrs. Lillian Pope, who lived 12 miles east of the ridge. She wrote about hearing what she believed were voices carried by the wind from the west. "It is not quite human speech, but near enough to stir memory. My pupils refuse to walk home that way after dusk. They say the ground whispers names." When asked which names, she hesitated before answering. Jonas, Eleanor, Martha. Names long buried in half-remembered archives. Around the same time, local historian Clifford Wainscott attempted to organize a small excavation to settle the matter once and for all. He obtained permission from the county, raised a modest fund, and hired 3 men to assist. His private correspondence, later donated to Guthrie College, tells what happened next. "We dug only 2 feet before hitting wood, but it was not any foundation. The grain ran vertical, as though we'd struck the wall of a shaft. There was a smell, oil, earth, and something else. Old meat, perhaps. One of the men gagged. We filled the hole and left. Wainscott's project ended there. 2 weeks later, he left town citing personal illness. Even as the world outside modernized, telephones humming, automobiles scattering the prairie dust, the ridge remained untouched. Maps still left it blank. The train line rerouted east to avoid the unstable soil. The last homestead within 5 miles was abandoned in 1929. In later academic work, researchers noted the eerie symmetry between the story of Corrick's Rest and the outlaw aftermath of the Battle of Ingalls, both products of lawless frontiers, both swallowed by fire and silence. But while Ingalls left bullet holes and headlines, Corrick's Rest left nothing tangible, just an absence that fed its own myth. In 1930, a drought cracked the ridge open once more. A passing geologist stopped to take a soil sample and found small fragments of pottery mixed with ash. Among them was a single brass button, identical to those issued to territorial marshals in the 1870s. He kept it on his desk for years, polished to a dull shine. When he died, his assistant noted it was missing from his effects. Today, no one can say where that button went, or why, on some nights, the ridge still flickers faintly, as if catching the reflection of a lantern far below the earth. By 1931, drought and wind had stripped most of Benton County bare. The Dust Bowl had turned the prairie into an ocean of grit and static, erasing fence lines, barns, even whole farms. For a while, Corrick's Ridge, once known as the Hollow, was invisible beneath dunes of shifting soil. But survivors of that long, dry season would later swear that, even when everything else lay buried, the shape of the old inn's foundation sometimes reappeared, a faint rectangular shadow in the dust. A relief worker named Harold Van, assigned to photograph storm damage, took one such picture. In the bottom corner of the print, a dark patch lies against the horizon, square, symmetrical, almost architectural. Van didn't notice it until he developed the film in Guthrie. He sent the photograph to his supervisor with a note. Maybe the remains of a house, though it does not seem to catch light like wood or stone, more like a hole pretending to be a shadow. The image has since vanished from archives, recorded only in a 1933 catalog description. During those hungry years, families fleeing the storms built temporary camps wherever the ground seemed stable. One of those encampments, known as Camp Mercy, was placed unintentionally less than half a mile from the ridge. The residence lasted less than a month. A report from the Oklahoma Emergency Board states, abandonment due to illness of unspecified origin. 14 cases of severe coughing fits, 3 deaths. Survivors insisted on relocation. Camp found destroyed by wind upon return. Folklore merged with desperation. Mothers told children not to wander west, warning, the soil there remembers breath. The phrase passed from tent to tent, became a kind of Dust Bowl proverb, stripped of its origin but still carrying the chill of its meaning. When the storms finally eased in 1935, government teams revisited the area to assess what could be reclaimed. They found the ridge unchanged. No erosion, no sand drifts, as though it had resisted the disaster entirely. Beneath a crust of ash lay the same black soil, damp to the touch. One worker pressed his hand into it and later told a companion that it felt like something breathing slow. He quit the next day and refused to return. That same year, the Guthrie Historical Review printed an article on sites of persistent folklore in the Oklahoma Territory. Corrick's Rest was listed briefly between outlaw battlefields and ghost towns. The author, Dr. Julia Marin, noted how stories of the ridge resurfaced every generation whenever hardship forces people to look backward for reasons. She called it a living scar of the frontier. Still, Marin's essay ended with a troubling footnote. Having visited the ridge myself in April of this year, I can attest to a faint tremor beneath the soil, rhythmic and consistent. It was not wind, nor the echo of machinery. I measured 5 pulses, then silence. After publication, she never wrote again. Colleagues said she left Guthrie for good, moving east to live with family. But her field bag, containing maps, journals, and one small vial labeled Corix soil sample, was found years later in the basement of the Historical Review's offices. The cork had rotted. The vial was empty. And though the Dust Bowl had erased most traces of human life from that part of Oklahoma, the ridge, they say, still stood there unburied, steady, waiting, as if the rest of the world had been swept away just so it could remain. By the late 1930s, the country was clawing its way out of the Depression. The land had begun to heal, yet in that lonely stretch of Oklahoma where Corix Rest once stood, the ground seemed unwilling to join the living again. It remained barren, no grass, no crops, only a low mound that shifted like an old scar in the wind. That year, a federal project to map rural homesteads brought a photographer, Evelyn Ray, to Benton County. Her assignment was simple: document abandoned sites for the Historical Land Office. In her surviving journal, one entry stands apart from the rest. Traveled south of Guthrie, found the ridge mentioned by locals. Nothing left, only dust and the faintest smell of oil. Took 3 exposures before noon. In each frame, the shadows shift strangely, as though the ground itself had turned to face the camera. Ray's negatives reached Washington with her full set of reports, yet when they were catalogued the following spring, 3 were missing, the ones labeled Corix Rest. Not long after, the Works Progress Administration dispatched a small crew to dig test trenches along the ridge, hoping to uncover remains of early settlement architecture. The foreman, Arthur Hemley, later wrote in his field log, "At a depth of 4 feet, hit what appears to be compacted soil, possibly clay floor. Then a hollow opened beneath. Heard air move, soft even. Men refused to dig further, said it was like breathing from below." The trench was filled by order of the county office, citing unstable ground. In the years that followed, the site fell back into silence. Yet stories continued to drift through the nearby towns. A faint light seen after rainstorms, whispers carried on still nights, and the tapping, always the tapping. Farmers described it to visiting folklorists as steady, deliberate, 5 beats, then 2, like a coded knock on a wooden door. When Professor Charles Eldred Voss of Oklahoma State University began compiling oral histories in 1938, he noticed something strange. Each storyteller, separated by miles and years, repeated one line exactly: "The house is still building." Voss, intrigued, visited the ridge himself that autumn. His notes end abruptly after the words, "Soil warm, sound rhythmic, coming from below, smell of lamp oil. Something hollow there." The next page is blank. His car was found 2 days later, parked neatly by the road. The driver's door was open, the engine cold. Voss was never located. Authorities searched briefly, but the area had changed since the storms. Gullies filled with dust, and landmarks no longer matched maps. The official conclusion was that he had wandered off and succumbed to the heat. Privately, his colleagues disagreed. A month later, when Voss's papers were sorted for university records, one item puzzled the archivist: a small piece of glass, half melted, with soot along the edge, clearly part of a lantern lens. Someone had etched into it, faintly but deliberately, "We keep what the road forgets." The archivist returned it to its folder, unsure of its significance. The next morning, it was gone. By 1939, the state declared the ridge closed to excavation, citing sinkholes and gas pockets. Yet the locals knew better. They said it wasn't gas moving under that soil, just the house below still breathing, waiting for someone to knock back. In the first spring of 1940, when the nation stood on the edge of war and the Dust Bowl's ghosts were still settling, a new kind of curiosity returned to the ridge. This time it came not from settlers or historians, but from a government agency. The Geological Survey Division sought to chart subsurface vibrations recorded during the dust storms, strange tremors that seemed to originate from regions long thought geologically dead. Corix Ridge was among the test sites. 2 technicians, Milton Groves and Ray Avery, arrived in April to install seismographs. Their equipment was simple: metal rods, pressure plates, and wax cylinder recorders. They expected static, nothing more. 3 days later, Groves filed a brief memorandum that would later circulate quietly through the department. Station 4, Corrick Site, registering consistent rhythmic pattern, interval exactly 27 seconds. Not seismic, not wind. Feels deliberate, sounds faintly like hammer on timber through ground. They moved the instruments a half-mile east. The sound stopped. When they returned the next day, the equipment had shifted 6 inches in the night, though no footprints marked the soil. Avery, unnerved, refused to stay after dark. Groves, more curious than cautious, left one recorder running overnight. When he retrieved it the next morning, the wax cylinder had cracked from heat, but still held sound. 5 knocks, a pause, then 2. The same pattern recorded by earlier witnesses half a century before. The cylinder was sent to Guthrie for analysis but never reached the archive. Internal correspondence shows it was misplaced in transit. Groves resigned soon after and took a position out of state. Avery joined the Army the next year and was killed overseas. That same summer, a local farmer, Caleb Merton, reported losing a herd of goats near the ridge. He found them days later, all gathered at the edging of a sinkhole, staring downward. "Not one made a sound," he wrote in his ledger. "They just listened, as if something was calling from below." A few months later, a brush fire swept the area, but curiously stopped at the ridge itself. Firefighters said the flames rolled around it like water around stone. When they dug into the ash, they found the soil beneath damp and cool, untouched by fire. The event revived old fears. Newspapers revisited the legend, reprinting fragments of the Corrick story alongside other tales of buried violence. The Guthrie Times ran a headline, "Where the Earth Still Breathes." It drew visitors again, poets, photographers, even spiritualists who called the ridge a thin place, where memory pressed close to the living world. One group held a séance there in September 1940. They left by dawn, shaken and silent. The only record of their session is a scrap of transcription found later in their abandoned tent. Voice heard through table, female, faint, repeated one word: home. By the end of that year, the state fenced the ridge once more, declaring it a protected geological anomaly. Officially, it was now a restricted zone. Unofficially, the locals called it what they always had, Corrick's Rest. And though the tools had changed and the world had moved on, the story remained the same. Something beneath that soil was still building, still waiting, still keeping what the road forgot. By 1941, the ridge was quiet again, sealed behind its wire fence and government warnings. The nation's focus turned outward, to Europe, to war, to the future. And for a brief time, Corrick's Rest faded from thought. Yet silence never lasted long there. That autumn, a passing freight train reported a tremor strong enough to rattle the tracks, though no quake registered elsewhere. The conductor, Henry Walsh, recorded the incident in his logbook. Near mile marker 242, westbound, ground vibration felt. No wind, sky clear. Heard hollow echo like wood under strain. 5 knocks, pause, then 2. Same again 30 seconds later. His note, one among thousands in wartime paperwork, went unread for years. Around that same time, an elderly woman named Ruth Corrick appeared in the town of Guthrie. She claimed to be the granddaughter of Jedediah and Martha Corrick, though no record of her lineage could be verified. She was quiet, soft-spoken, and lived in a boarding house near the old courthouse. One evening, she visited the public library, asking to see the maps of my grandfather's land. The librarian on duty, Mrs. Leland, later wrote of the encounter in a private letter. She spread the maps on the table and traced her finger over the ridge again and again, whispering something I could not catch. When I asked if she was doing research, she said, "I just need to know if it's still breathing." Ruth left before closing and was not seen again. In her rented room, they found only a suitcase, a Bible, and a lantern, its glass pane etched faintly with the same phrase that had haunted the story for decades: "We keep what the road forgets." News of her disappearance reached only a few local ears. One was Deputy Marshal Allen Price, who, curious, rode out to the ridge on his own. The site was barren save for fence posts and wild grass. He later testified that he found the gate open, and footprints leading inward, barefoot, small. They stopped halfway to the center and did not return. Price camped nearby that night. His report ends with a single paragraph, shaky and uneven. Heard knocking from below, steady as a heartbeat. Soil moved once beneath my hand. I called out, thinking it a trick of air. Then a woman's voice said, "The house is finished." I left before dawn. He resigned 2 weeks later, citing nerves. By the winter of 1942, the ridge had been reclaimed once more by the elements. The wind carried dust across the wire, the signs rusted, and the story fell back into its long sleep. Only the most tenacious archivists still mentioned the name Corrick, usually as a footnote in papers about Oklahoma folklore or post-frontier isolation. One such scholar, Dr. Nathaniel Evers, concluded his 1943 essay with an observation that perfectly captured the paradox of Corrick's Rest. Unlike the notorious outlaws of Ingalls, whose memory lives in gunfire and graves, the Corricks achieved something rarer. They were absorbed completely. The land became their monument, the silence their biography. After the war, Evers planned a final field visit to the ridge. He never returned. His car was found on the highway shoulder, keys still in the ignition, and the driver's seat covered in a fine layer of black soil. No footprints, no sign of struggle, only the faint scent of lamp oil in the air. The year 1946 brought rain again, thick cleansing storms that rolled across Oklahoma for days. Fields that had lain dead through the war turned green, rivers swelled, and for the first time in years, the land felt alive. But on the ridge, once known as Corrick's Rest, the rain revealed more than it restored. A ranch hand named Tom Grady, working cattle near the restricted fence line, noticed the earth sagging in a long oval depression after one particularly heavy downpour. Curious, he rode closer and saw faint lines emerging in the mud, rectangles, beams, corners. It was like a house drawing itself out of the ground, he told his foreman. When he returned the next morning, the shapes had vanished. Grady's description made its way to the Guthrie Times, which ran a short piece titled, "Old Inn Resurfaces in the Rain." The article drew attention from both skeptics and historians. Among them was Dr. Caroline Holt, a university geographer cataloging post-Dust Bowl topography. She received permission to conduct a brief survey before the area was sealed again. Holt's notes, preserved in a box marked Fieldwork, 1946, described the ridge as remarkably sound despite erosion elsewhere. Using simple instruments, she measured subtle subsurface cavities beneath the surface, perfectly rectangular voids, 6 by 8 feet each, descending in a spiral pattern. Not natural, she wrote, consistent with intentional architecture, timber resonance when probed, possibly remains of cellars or tunnels. She also noted a smell rising from one fissure, not decay, but oil and wet iron. Her assistant grew nauseous and refused to continue. They filled the test hole with sand before leaving. Later that week, Holt returned alone to check the instruments she left behind. The data log, retrieved the next morning by local rangers, recorded faint rhythmic vibrations at intervals of 30 seconds. 5 beats, a pause, then 2. When the rangers went to recover the sensors, the cables were snapped cleanly, as if cut from below. Holt vanished soon after. Her car was found on the access road, trunk open, boots neatly placed beside it. The only trace left behind was a rolled map pinned under a stone, showing the ridge drawn in heavy pencil strokes. Across it, she'd written a single note, "Still breathing. Authorities closed the site permanently. Official explanation, unstable sinkholes." Unofficially, locals said the government wanted the place forgotten for good. Over the following decade, wind and vegetation covered the last visible traces of the ridge. Farmers fenced their fields around it. Children heard only fragments of the tale, something about a haunted hotel or a family that vanished underground. By the time statehood anniversaries came and went, Corrick's Rest was a phrase known only to archivists and old-timers. But during certain storms, when the rain drives hard enough to expose the old earth, travelers still claim to see a faint lantern light glowing beneath the puddles. It moves slowly, following the pattern of a spiral, circling, sinking, circling again, until the water fills and hides it once more. Those who see it never stop their wagons or cars. They keep their eyes on the horizon, whispering what the old settlers used to say whenever thunder rolled across that cursed ground. Let the house keep what it's owed. By 1949, the ridge had almost completely vanished from public memory. The war had rewritten the nation's attention, and Oklahoma's frontier past seemed quaint beside the atomic age. Yet the land itself did not forget. That spring, a team of telephone linemen were ordered to install new poles across the outlying districts west of Guthrie. When they reached the coordinates near the old boundary of Corrick's Rest, their equipment failed. Compasses spun, lines hummed, and the air grew oddly warm. The crew chief, Earl Matheson, recorded the event in his log. "Poles won't hold. Ground too soft. Hammering feels like driving into a drum. I swear something's hollow down there." His foreman dismissed it as poor soil. But that night, while camping along the road, the men heard a steady thudding coming from the ridge. Slow, patient, like someone driving nails in perfect rhythm. They packed before sunrise and rerouted the line 3 miles north. The company filed no complaint, but Matheson later returned on his own. His wife found his truck a week later, idling by the fence. Inside were his gloves, his tools, and a photograph of the area. In the photo, faintly visible in the background, stood a figure holding a lantern, though no one had been with him when he took it. That image circulated privately among linemen for years, passed from hand to hand with the warning, "Don't work west of 242." In the early 1950s, a wave of nostalgia swept through Oklahoma. Local historians began cataloging lost places of the territory era. Corrick's Rest resurfaced briefly in a small pamphlet titled Frontier Shadows, authored by Helen Murchison, a retired schoolteacher. She pieced together old clippings, martial reports, and fragments of testimony, comparing the legend to the outlaw enclaves destroyed after the Battle of Ingalls. "Where Ingalls ended in gunfire," she wrote, "Corrick's Rest in Moz, dead in the deeper violence of silence." Murchison sent copies of her pamphlet to libraries across the state. Within months, all were stolen or misplaced. Only one survives today in a private collection, its cover stained with what looks like oil. In 1952, a severe thunderstorm cut power to nearby farms. When linesmen went out to repair the damage, they found several poles along the old route near the ridge had sunk nearly a foot overnight. Beneath one, they discovered an exposed beam, ancient wood, smooth as glass, smelling faintly of smoke and iron. They reburied it and left, claiming later that the ground seemed to hum beneath their boots. A year later, a local boy wandered too close while chasing a stray calf. He returned pale and trembling, saying he'd seen a door in the dirt and heard someone knocking from the other side. His parents dismissed it as imagination, but by morning he was gone. Only his shoes were found, neatly side by side beside the fence. That was the final recorded incident. After 1954, the county paved a new highway several miles north, cutting off access to the site. The ridge was officially decommissioned, listed on state maps as private reserve, no entry. No one lives within 5 miles of it now. The land grows only brittle weeds and twisted mesquite. Still, on hot nights when the air holds still, travelers on the distant road say they can see a faint light pulsing where the inn once stood. 5 flashes, a pause, then 2, always the same pattern. The story, it seems, refuses to rest, just like the earth that carries its name. By the summer of 1955, the story of Corrick's Rest belonged to no one. The land was fenced, sealed, and forgotten by law, yet it lingered in the edges of conversation, spoken softly, like a superstition inherited but never believed. Newcomers to Guthrie heard fragments from the old-timers. A vanished inn, a family swallowed by their own cellar, a light that still burned where no house remained. No one knew if any of it was true. Still, people avoided the ridge. That same year, the Oklahoma Historical Commission conducted a quiet aerial survey of abandoned frontier properties. One photograph, taken at dusk, accidentally caught the ridge in its frame. When developed, the film showed a faint geometric outline, rectangular, symmetrical, etched into the soil as though the foundation of a building had risen to the surface. At its center, a pale circular mark glowed faintly, too bright to be explained by reflection. The technician who printed the image marked it "light anomaly" and filed it away. Weeks later, the office suffered a small fire. Most of the aerial negatives were destroyed. Only the index entry remained: Corex site, anomaly present. By 1957, the area was overgrown with thistle and drought grass. The fence rusted away, and wind filled the old trenches. Highway travelers passed within sight of the ridge without realizing what it was. But every so often, a driver would slow, glance at the horizon, and swear that for a second he'd seen a lantern swaying in the dark. One of them, a trucker named Bill Warner, later wrote to the Guthrie Times, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw. A small light moving along the ground in a spiral, slow and steady. I thought it was a house lamp, but when I looked again, it was gone." The radio cut out right after, and the smell of kerosene filled the cab. "The editor never printed the letter, but kept it in a folder lay." Belid, Frontier Lore. By the end of the decade, the ridge was removed from all official state maps. It existed only in the footnotes of old academic texts and whispered memories among families whose ancestors had once lived near the trail. Yet even silence leaves a trace. Locals noticed that no birds nested there, no insects swarmed, and on the hottest days the ground gave off a faint shimmer, as if heat rose from something still burning beneath. Some say the Corex were only people, caught in hardship, driven mad by solitude, buried by history. Others believe they built something more than a home. They built a place that would not die, a house that fed on quiet, on forgetting, until even the earth itself learned to keep secrets. And sometimes, when storms roll out of the west and lightning flashes low across the prairie, that secret reveals itself for an instant, a flicker of light in the hollow, 5 beats and 2, as if someone deep below were still at work, still hammering, still keeping what the road forgot. Oklahoma's frontier moved on. The names changed, the roads shifted, the towns rebuilt, but the ridge remains. A breath in the soil, a shadow that remembers, a silence that answers back.